Now let us turn to, in greater detail, to Clausewitz's theory of war. And what we're going to do is examine some of the key characteristic, key features, key fundamental claims that we find in Clausewitz about the nature of war, and some of the corresponding concepts that Clausewitz employs, concepts that still have quite widespread currency today. The first principle, the first kind of theoretical conception that Clausewitz elaborates is the idea of war as nothing but a duel on a larger scale. So Clausewitz is trying to think in the early pages of On War, in chapter 1, which was revised quite late, so reflects his final thinking really on the matter. Clausewitz tries to understand what is war in its most basic sense. And he says, well, it's akin to a duel. Two wrestlers fighting with one another. It is, he says, an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. We want our adversary to do something, and since we cannot get them to do this by any other means, we choose force. And for this reason, because Clausewitz believed that ultimately war is characterized by the act of force, Clausewitz was very dismissive of attempts to mitigate or minimize the violence inherent to war. Ultimately, the reason war works, in a sense, the purpose of war, is to win it so that you make your adversary incapable, by making your adversary incapable of further resistance. Once your adversary cannot resist your force anymore, then you can impose your will. They have to do what you want them to do. And how do you make them incapable of further resistance? You strike hard at the crux of their power to resist. So you undermine their ability to resist you. And therefore, there's no point in holding back, in trying to minimize the force that you use, because only by undermining that resistance decisively will you be able to impose your will on them. We can here understand why Clausewitz uses a further metaphor, the metaphor of the center of gravity. Clausewitz explains that the center of gravity is the hub of all power and movement, on which everything depends. It is, he says, the point against which all our energies should be directed. In other words, the center of gravity is the core strength of the enemy, and therefore it is what we must strike at. Again, think of the metaphor of two wrestlers. The center of gravity is what allows a wrestler to stand on his feet, to be balanced. If you strike at their center of gravity, if you unbalance them, then you will have them on the ground, they will be at your mercy. So Clausewitz is keen to make this point, that we need to direct our energies, our strength at the enemy's center of gravity. But what does this mean? What is a center of gravity when we're thinking about war? Well, Clausewitz thinks that mainly the center of gravity is the enemy's army. So in other words, if we destroy the enemy's army, then they no longer have the means to resist, then we can impose our will upon them. But Clausewitz concedes that it might not always be the army, it might perhaps be the enemy's capital. If you capture their capital city, you will equally have defeated them. Or it might be their allies. If a state that's resisting you is resting on a complex alliance, if you manage to pick off their alliance, then you might also be able to prevail. It might also, he suggests elsewhere, be public opinion. If you strike at the popular support for the war, you will equally undermine its ability to sustain its effort. So again, Clausewitz says, well, this depends on the type of conflict. Again, there are no single solutions, single answers, single recipes to fight war. It ultimately depends on the specific historical context we find ourselves in. Nonetheless, the military is, Clausewitz says very repeatedly, generally the center of gravity, and therefore the purpose of military maneuvers must be to seek the decisive battle. The decisive battle being the battle in which you decisively defeat the enemy. And so Clausewitz also refers repeatedly to the idea of the maximum concentration of force. He says, I quote, "The larger the force with which the blow is struck, the surer its effect will be. Again, Clausewitz insists, don't hold back. Marshal all the forces that you can, strike at your enemy's army, defeat it decisively, impose yourself on that other state, dictate the terms of peace. This is strikingly very much what Napoleon engaged in the Napoleonic Wars. And if that sounds kind of self-evident, well, actually it wasn't, because in the 18th century prior to that, or in fact in the two previous centuries, decisive battles were not very common at all. States, monarchs, other entities were often very cautious in engaging their armies. They wanted to avoid battles where they might lose their entire armies because the consequences would be dramatic. And so Napoleon really introduced, or perhaps reintroduced, an idea of the decisive battle and practiced it again with very great efficiency, again maybe drawing on the superior popular resources he had to do so. But in any case, Clausewitz very much makes this one of his principles. But again, maybe this is not a concept that has universal value. Think about where we might see decisive battles today, and it's not so clear that decisive battles, in the sense Clausewitz understood them, are a very common occurrence today. Now, for all of Clausewitz's discussion about centers of gravity and so forth, it's important to restate again that On War is not a manual on how to successfully wage war according to a few formulae. Clausewitz reserves some of his sharpest barbs in his criticism of those who seek to provide general scientific principles for victory at all times. So Clausewitz has in mind many of his contemporaries who, at the time, and we have to recall that Clausewitz lives at a time that's the time of the Enlightenment, and what the Enlightenment was as an intellectual movement in European society was the idea that the application of reason to the understanding of nature and to society was the surest way to progress and to knowledge. And Newton and others had shown through the development of the scientific method how the application of reason could unlock some fundamental properties, some of the fundamental laws of nature, whereby you could produce mathematical geometric formula that could explain, as in Newton's case, all the movements of all the bodies in the universe. Now, military theorists, inspired by these successes, also sought to apply these same principles. And so what some of Clausewitz's contemporaries and predecessors had done was to look through the entire recorded history and try to identify those key underlying principles, even mathematical principles, that would ensure victory in every single situation. And so we find contemporary to Clausewitz very elaborate treatises in which are devised mathematical systems that focus on angles of attack between attack and defense, numerical weightings of different factors, and so on. We find this work notably in the work of someone like Heinrich von Bülow. So if we look, for example, at the slide here, we can see on the left a kind of geometric illustration of von Bülow's ideas. That effectively you needed to measure the length of triangles formed by the point of the army and the base of operations, that there were ideal angles of attack, and so forth. Von Bülow goes so far as to say that when war has reached the stage of a science, and that this is an eminently achievable goal, when war is a science, it will no longer be called an art, because everyone will then be capable of understanding an application. The art itself will be a science or be lost in it. Now, Clausewitz has no time for this. He doesn't believe that war can ever be a science. And he has two main objections to this approach. The first is that he believes that these approaches neglect the role of moral factors. That's to say, the role of spirit, of morale, the strength of feeling and sentiment that must animate an army when it fights. Fighting is not merely a set of equations and cold calculations. It's a passionate, hot-blooded affair. And these things cannot be easily quantifiable and are missing from these kinds of geometric or mathematical models. The second reason is that Clausewitz argues that these types of approaches tend to only pay regard to activity on one side. They look at the ways in which one army has to optimize its strategies, its tactics in order to win. But Clausewitz says this is a complete misconception about the inherent dynamic of war. War, Clausewitz tells us, is a constant state of reciprocal action, the effects of which are mutual. So Clausewitz has a profoundly dynamic understanding of war. War is, as he puts it, the shock of two hostile bodies in collision, not the action of a living power upon an inanimate mass. War is a complex interplay of action and reaction, an interaction of forces. One side makes its move, conducts some maneuvers, deploys some tactics. The other side responds. And when one side prevails, the other side will tend to learn. It will adjust its behavior. What works will be repeated. What fails to work will be amended. So Clausewitz is keen to make this interaction central to his theoretical conception. This leads further to a very important distinction within Clausewitz. Clausewitz draws a distinction between what he calls ideal war and real war. Ideal war is war in the abstract, the pure logic of the concept. What is war when we think of it as detached from historical and social circumstances, if we think of it just as what the concept requires? Well, Clausewitz claims that in the abstract, war tends to the extremes. So he thinks that this interplay of action-reaction, which I've just explained, will on its own lead to a cycle of actions and counteractions which will see an escalation. Every side will try to outdo the other, throwing more resources into the war, until the war escalates to what Clausewitz calls absolute war, when everything that could be thrown into it has been. And the culmination of this is the total destruction of one side by the other, at which point, of course, war ceases. Clausewitz says, war is an act of force, and there is no logical limit to the application of that force. Each side, therefore, compels its opponent to follow suit. A reciprocal action is started which must lead, in theory, to extremes. But, and this is critical, Clausewitz then explains that this is only the ideal conception of war. That real war, war in the actual concrete world, necessarily falls short of its absolute realization. War never escalates to the extremes. Why? Well, Clausewitz says, first of all, war is never an isolated act. It doesn't happen in this entirely abstract sense. There's always a particular historical and political context that explains why the sides are fighting in the first place, that conditions the use of force and the escalation that might follow from it. So we can't think of war entirely abstractly. This is, again, important to Clausewitz. Secondly, Clausewitz says, war does not consist of a single short blow, which would definitively decide the outcome. So in other words, Clausewitz says, well, if the logic of war is the escalation to the extremes, then in principle, war would reach the extremes immediately. Once the logic is intelligible to both sides, and you know that this is the process that war is going to follow, you might as well throw everything you have in at the start. But that, Clausewitz says, is impossible. You can't win war in a single blow. So therefore there has to be a process of escalation that takes time. And this factor of time is essential. Again, Clausewitz sums up. Were it a complete, untrammeled, absolute manifestation of violence, as the pure concept would require, war would of its own independent will usurp the place of policy the moment policy had brought it into being. It would then drive policy out of office and rule by the laws of its own nature. In reality, war is not like that. Policy will permeate all military operations, and insofar as their violent nature will admit, it will have a continuous influence on them. So what is Clausewitz saying here? Clausewitz is saying it's not sufficient when we talk about the role of politics in war to think merely about the conditioning of war, the reasons that a war might start, the grievances or the political struggle that might lead to war. We have to think about politics permeating the conduct of war. And here again, this use of this notion of temporality is important, because what Clausewitz is saying is war is deployed as a rational means. Politics is the realm of rational application of force, or of reasoning in general, of which force is one of the tools. And so government goes to war when it decides that it is in its interest, that it can't achieve its goals in any other way, and therefore it needs to wage war as the most practical, expedient ways to get to its outcome. Now, because war takes time, if you want, because the escalation cannot be instantaneous, after every round, so to speak, after every major exchange or battle, there will be a moment, a pause, in which governments, in which leaders will reflect on the outcome of that battle and will think about what they should do next. Whether they should commit more resources to the war, or whether they are actually in a position to dictate their terms now, or whether they're now in such a weak position that there is no point in them continuing to struggle. In other words, Clausewitz wants to make the point that governments are constantly assessing and reasoning about the outcome of a war, about the resources to put to it, about tethering the goals that they have and the resources that they're willing to put in them. What is the prize? Is the prize worth the cost? So, because of this, Clausewitz argues that this means-end calculus is continuously updated through the course of military action, and that there is always a point short of annihilation where one side will decide it is more rational to cease combat. Once your army has been destroyed or almost completely destroyed, once your cities are burning, why continue to fight? At that point, you surrender. The surrender is better than the annihilation that is promised to you. And for the other side, unless they are waging a war of genocide, they will also eventually accept the terms of the peace that the other side is willing to accept. So for Clausewitz, war, therefore, real war never reaches this kind of absolute form of war, even though it can approach it. Clausewitz would have, at certain points in his writing, did think that Napoleonic War, that was very intense and of unprecedented intensity, certainly in historical memory, was perhaps a form of absolute war, although later on he reflected that it hadn't quite reached that point. One might think, of course, about the total war of the first half of the 20th century. In the Second World War, the resources that were put into war were also unprecedented up to that time. We could, however, perhaps observe that the notion of absolute war, the notion of an escalation to the absolute extremes that would happen almost immediately, is perhaps in fact a possibility today. The picture on the slide is that of the war room in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, the famous satire about nuclear war. And what we see, of course, in the course of the film is how, on an accidental basis, a nuclear war is started, and the mechanism of that nuclear war cannot be stopped. And it's certainly true that in the context of nuclear war, and of course we have the opportunity to return to that later in the course, what we see is, taking the example of the Cold War, we see two sides, the Soviet Union and United States in this case, in possession of nuclear arsenals so powerful and able to be delivered so quickly that one side could annihilate the other at a moment's notice. And of course, eventually, both sides could annihilate themselves, each other. So when that occurrence, of course, would in a way be a realization of Clausewitz's idea of absolute war. Once the missiles are flying, you can't call them back. There's no room for politics. We're just going to have to live with the consequences of those missiles landing. And given the power of these missiles, it's likely to mean annihilation. But let us move on. Another very important concept within Clausewitz is the idea of the Trinity of War. Clausewitz argues that war is guided by this trinity, by three elements, by three components that are inseparably linked. And while their interplay will change and vary according to each war, they are present in every conflict. So what are the elements of this trinity? The first we have just encountered is what Clausewitz calls the subordinate nature of a political tool, through which war becomes subject to reason. So here on the bottom right on this diagram, what Clausewitz says is that one of the aspects of war, one of the legs of the Trinity, is the fact that war is a political instrument, that governments, states wield war as part of a rational calculus. Secondly, Clausewitz explains that war is composed by its primordial violence, that war is inherently the realm, as he puts it, of hatred and enmity, which must be regarded as a blind natural instinct. So what Clausewitz wants to say is that in order to have war, we need enmity, we need hostility, we need hatred. If you don't have this feeling, then you won't have war. That elemental nature of war, that passion injected into war, is essential. And this, of course, could speak to perhaps the escalation of war. Finally, Clausewitz refers to the interplay of probability and chance, which has to be creatively handled. So one of the important points that Clausewitz makes about war that we haven't broached yet is the fact that it is an inherently unpredictable venture. There are many elements of probability and chance that come into play that mean the calculations and the designs of governments can be derailed. Now Clausewitz therefore is keen to say that these three elements have to be present in every war. And he tends to associate, and certainly many commentators after that have tended to associate, particular entities to these characteristics. So the political dimension is associated with government or state, the primordial violence with people, and the interplay of probability and chance that has to be handled by the army. It's the province of the military itself. So very often we see the Trinity encapsulated by those entities. So one way the Trinity might be referred to is as the Trinity of government, army, and people. But it's important to note that this is not the way in which Clausewitz first conceptualizes the Trinity. Clausewitz refers to these more abstract ideas primarily. And so theorists, the scholars, have distinguished between what they call the primary Trinity, the kind of abstract concepts, and the secondary Trinity, those particular types of entities. And it's an important distinction because depending on which Trinity you look at, you might have different views on how relevant Clausewitz or how applicable the framework of the Trinity is. Because if you assume that Clausewitz is saying that every war needs to have an army, a government, and a people, then you might be able to summon examples where you might suggest, well, there is no state involved in an army. What about non-state wars? Or or civil wars. If you take the more abstract concepts, then you might find that they have a broader relevance, that even though there might not be a state, there might still be actors who subordinate their policy to, or their use of force to a certain idea of reason or instrumentality. To illustrate how Clausewitz thinks about these Trinitarian aspects and their interplay, it's quite useful to watch a short video of a scientific experiment that Clausewitz describes briefly in On War, and that he would have certainly witnessed at the time he was writing it. Clausewitz says that the Trinity must be considered, and its theory must be, similarly, as like an object suspended among three magnets. So the experiment is a fairly simple one. You create a triangle of magnets and you place a metallic object suspended between them. And what happens when you release that object is that it will travel between the various basins of electromagnetic attraction and produce a complex movement in doing so. And the movement will not be reproducible every time you release that magnet, because you will release it at a slightly, minutely different starting position. It will follow a different course. In many ways, what Clausewitz anticipates in this experiment is what would later be known as nonlinear dynamics, systems that are not easily predictable, that are very sensitive to the initial conditions of the experiment. And so we can see, therefore, one of the reasons why Clausewitz is skeptical of any claims to a scientific theory of war. Yes, he gives a role to rationality in the role of state or the subordination of military policy to reason, but he also describes the role of the passions and of chance, realms that are not subject to rationality. The passions is quite the opposite. It's a realm of irrationality, and chance is irrational. Is not governed necessarily by any rational principle. Clausewitz is very keen to underline the emotional dimension of war. If war is an act of force, he says, then emotions cannot fail to be involved. This explains why war is a phenomenon capable of erupting with the suddenness, as he puts it, of a perfect explosion. War, he says, is a pulsation of violent force, more or less vehement, consequently making its discharges and exhausting its powers more or less quickly. Again, in the kind of interplay between reason and the non-rational aspects of war, Clausewitz is trying to express the idea that although we might have very rational designs for setting off a war, once a war breaks out, it will bring into play all sorts of non-rational factors that mean we can't necessarily control the course of war. Control can be exerted partially, but it will be in the face of unruly energies that have been released through conflict. So, having discussed at some length the aspects of reason and passion, let's talk about the last elements of chance. Clausewitz explains that absolute, I'm quoting here, so-called mathematical factors never find a firm basis in military calculations. From the very start, there is an interplay of possibilities, probabilities, good luck and bad that weaves its way through the length and breadth of the tapestry. In the whole range of human activities, war most closely resembles a game of cards. So Clausewitz tells us that war is a game of cards, a game affected by chance. But note, he hasn't picked a purely random game. He hasn't said that war is a game of roulette. Anything could happen. All outcomes are equally likely. No, a game of cards typically involves a chance element in that you don't know which cards you have, and you don't necessarily know which cards your adversary has, although you can guess to some extent what they have on the basis of your own hand. on the basis of maybe perhaps the way that they're playing. But there is a skill element. You can play a hand better or worse. Maybe your hand is weak to start off with. Maybe your cards are not very good. But you have different ways of playing that hand, and you can play them better or worse. So chance is a very important dimension, but it is not everything, of course. So how does Clausewitz break down this component of chance? Because it's still very abstract at this point. Well, the first concept he draws on is the idea of friction. And friction is a very important concept for Clausewitz because it is, as he puts it, the difference between real war and what he calls war on paper. Again, we can have the abstraction, the simplified logical understanding of war, but when we translate into the real world, everything becomes more messy. Or as Clausewitz puts it, everything is very simple in war, but the simplest thing is difficult. Again, think about how he makes a distinction between ideal and real war. In the ideal of war, we can know exactly what we have to do, but in practice, things take time. There are obstacles and delays to exerting our will in the world. So, what are the sources of friction in war that Clausewitz identifies? Well, he identifies three of them, really. The first is the source of, or the cause of danger. He says war is a dangerous activity, and that induces fear. So soldiers have to contend with one of the most powerful emotions of fear, and that means that they will not necessarily do what they are instructed to do. They may become paralyzed by fear. They may be overcome by concern for their own safety. Secondly, there is the role of physical exertion. War is physically demanding. Armies have to walk long distances. Fighting is exhausting. And so when fatigue sets in, soldiers are also liable to underperform. Things won't go to plan because, again, under the combined effects of fear and fatigue. Thirdly, there is what Clausewitz calls the accumulation of difficulties and setbacks. One could perhaps pithily just call it the shit happens principle. Things go wrong. Clausewitz has a few illuminating lines on what he calls the accumulation of difficulties. For instance, he says, success is not due simply to general causes, but to particular factors that can be decisive, details only known to those who were on the spot. Issues can be decided by chances and incidents so minute as to figure in histories simply as anecdotes. So what Clausewitz is saying is very small incidents, very small things might have very large ramifications. One might think, for example, of the effect of weather, perhaps. Changing weather can devastate a campaign. Maybe this is less true today, although I think there's still a case that weather is still a very important factor that goes into military planning. But certainly in Clausewitz's time, a rain, a fog could be devastating for a campaign. But beyond that, what Clausewitz is also talking about in intuitive terms is again something that would be formulated later in scientific terminology under the principles of chaos. You may have heard of the butterfly effect. Butterfly effect is a metaphor deployed in the science of chaos theory, which makes the claim that, or illustrates it through the idea that the wings of a butterfly can cause a tornado. So the wings of a butterfly in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. What it's trying to point to here is that the weather, again, is a very complex non-linear system, and that small perturbations at one place in the system can easily accumulate into very large events. So again, in a military context, perhaps a tank breaks down and a column of reinforcements arrives too late to support a side, and the battle is lost. Very small incidents can accumulate into very large consequences, in other words. Then we have what Clausewitz refers to, or has been dubbed subsequently, the fog of war. And here what Clausewitz is interested in is in the idea that our knowledge of the battlefield is extremely flawed. We have never a full understanding or knowledge of what is going on, and there is an inherent difficulty in recognizing accurate from inaccurate information. So Clausewitz says, I quote here, "All action in war takes place in a kind of twilight, which like fog or moonlight often tends to make things seem grotesque and larger than they really are." So again, here's the metaphor of fog. It's as if the battlefield was enveloped in a fog and we cannot see clearly. Accordingly, Clausewitz is quite skeptical about the value of information, or the information that we receive in battle. He says, for instance, that a great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory, a still greater part is false, and by far the greatest part is of doubtful character. So most of the information that we get in war, Clausewitz is trying to tell us, is wrong, is misleading, is incomplete. And the difficulty, of course, is that while we may receive some good information, we have to have the ability to distinguish good from bad information, and that is not always going to be easy. So given all this, given friction, the fog, the role of chance, what is a military commander to do? What makes a great military commander? Well, for Clausewitz, it is all down to what he refers to as genius. And genius, I think, is a category that perhaps made a lot of sense to Clausewitz in the early 19th century, one that perhaps we're less comfortable with, because genius is tied, I think, to a certain kind of romantic idea of the great man, the great leader. Clausewitz believes that because war is not reducible to a set of formula, of equations, it is in fact a much more intuitive practice, and that some individuals are inherently more attuned to the demands of war, have the kinds of minds that can intuit what needs to be done. Circumstances, he says, vary so enormously in war and are so indefinable that a vast array of factors has to be appreciated, mostly in light of probabilities alone. The man responsible for evaluating the whole must bring to his task the quality of intuition that perceives the truth at every point. Otherwise, a chaos of opinions and considerations would arise and fatally entangle judgment. So again, Clausewitz is very keen on this role of intuition and instinct, and it's tied, I think, as well to the historical context in which he is writing. The early 19th century is characterized by what became known as the Romantic movement. And the Romantic movement was a response to the Enlightenment. Was put forward by a number of thinkers and poets and writers and painters and intellectuals who were dissatisfied with the Enlightenment idea of reason. It's not necessarily that they objected wholesale to the concept of reason, but that they believed that it was insufficient, inadequate to grasping reality, that not everything could be reduced to reason, that feeling and sentiment was just as important and just as real. And I think Clausewitz here is channeling some of that romanticism here. And no doubt that, again, the kind of figure that looms over all of this is the figure of Napoleon, the kind of great man incarnate. And throughout the 19th century, Napoleon was still a very powerful figure in the imaginary, even for people like Clausewitz, who in many ways hated Napoleon, who was an enemy of the French, but they recognized in Napoleon an exceptional individual, and he became a kind of a model of that, of the military genius. So while this concept of genius perhaps is not one we're so comfortable with, we're kind of more egalitarian societies today that don't necessarily like to elevate individuals as much, we could nonetheless recognize in Clausewitz this idea that reason is not the only way of approaching the conduct of war, that we also need to feel things, that we need to intuit things, we need to have a sense of what is the right thing to do at which moment, and that might not be reducible to equations, to mathematical principles, to scientific systems.